This is History Myths and Mythconceptions, and today's myth is Orgies in Ancient Rome. You obviously have heard that Rome was a citadel of debauchery, and for sure the Romans indulged not just in promiscuous sexual activities, but enthusiastically participated in orgies. Christian writers and pop culture, including books and movies, tell us exactly that. There's a very good joke about the situation. Unfortunately, I don't know the author. It goes like this. There have been more orgies in Hollywood movies than there were in ancient Rome. Well, yeah, it describes the problem perfectly. Obviously, I don't mean to say that there were no orgies in ancient Rome at all, in the modern sense of the word, which usually implies group sex as well. Things like that exist in any society. The only question is the scale of the phenomenon. But yes, you can find examples of orgies even in the most puritanical societies and in the most oppressive theocratic regimes. Orgies happen in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, and in the Vatican. The idea that any statistically significant portion of the population in ancient Rome participated in orgies is simply a lie that grows out of hostile religious propaganda. Do we have any evidence of these famous Roman orgies in historical sources and objects of material culture? Yes. But we don't have much. They are laughable, and they were interpreted with extreme prejudice and blown out of proportion. We also have a certain level of understanding of the morals of ancient Rome, and it should be emphasized that at least officially, this moral aspect has almost always gravitated towards traditional Roman virtue, the same one that largely shaped the concept of what is now considered a conservative form of sexual relations, monogamy, sometimes quite radical monogamy. Promiscuous sexual relations were more or less frowned upon in Rome, although, of course, a certain percentage of the population participated in them enthusiastically. We will never know the exact statistics on this issue, but based on the context, we can safely assume that the percentage was lower than, say, in modern Europe. It should be noted, however, that even now, when reliable contraceptive methods have been invented and the institution of traditional marriage is experiencing a mild crisis, it is almost impossible to imagine any country in the world where a public confession of participation in sex parties wouldn't disgust at least half of the people who just witnessed such a confession. There will be many people who will simply refuse to communicate with a person who publicly admits to something like that. And in the case of public figures, especially politicians, such statements can be a career suicide. If you think that things were different in Rome, then you are mistaken. Now let's proceed to the sources from which unscrupulous historians and Christian propagandists have extracted the idea of orgies. First of all, these are the accounts of ancient historians about major political figures of the era. More specifically, the attempts of writers to follow the norms of the genre of historical literature of ancient Rome and ascribe all possible vices to the emperors about whom the public or the Senate had formed a consensus that they were quote-unquote bad. Unfortunately, this is the moment we should single out Suetonius, writing at the beginning of the 2nd century AD. In his famous work, The 12 Caesars, or De Vita Caesarum, one can find a considerable amount of unsubstantiated lewd gossip, including the passages that can be interpreted as referencing group sex. Where exactly do we find the biggest concentration of these wonderful pieces of literature? Well, in the biographies of emperors Tiberius, Gaius Caligula, and Nero, the usual suspects. It is unlikely that any of them were actually culpable in participation in orgies. But even if they were, power corrupts people and politicians do a lot of extravagant things behind closed doors. Even if they were, it doesn't mean that it was a popular pastime in a rather traditionalist, for lack of a better word, society. Then we have the remains of non-historical ancient Roman literature, from which a propagandist can draw strange conclusions. We don't have much of this type of literature. In fact, it basically comes down only to Satyricon by Petronius. No, you don't really get orgies in Satyricon, it's just the overall atmosphere, which is quite debauched or frivolous, so to speak. Which is not surprising at all given the genre of the work. One could also try to read between the lines of Apuleius or Ovid. This requires quite a vivid imagination, which the Christians certainly had. In addition to that, in the 19th century, the Neapolitans excavated Pompeii, and they found there lewd images on the walls of a brothel. This is also used as an actual evidence of the depravity of the Romans and, by extension, of their irresistible desire to participate in orgies. Which is simply absurd, because, sorry for the redundancy, we are talking about images of erotic content in a brothel. And the mere fact that there were brothels in Roman cities proves absolutely nothing. Prostitution exists in every country of the world. Of course, we are told that there were quite a lot of brothels in Pompeii, about 10 of them. The problem is, well, only one can be identified reliably. And it doesn't look exactly as you might imagine. It's a small structure with a dozen tiny rooms designed to trigger the attack of claustrophobia. Finally, we have references to orgies in the original meaning of this word, in the ritual sense. Usually they refer to the orgiastic rituals of the cult of Bacchus. The problem is that the word orgy in English and in almost all modern languages does not mean the same thing as it does in Latin and ancient Greek. In the original form, it does not automatically imply group sex. It is important to note here that the Roman authorities had a serious conflict with the cult of Bacchus in 186 BC. It appears that sexual promiscuity was indeed practiced there, among other things. Promiscuity alone wasn't enough for conflict with the authorities. The cult was not only immoral, it was destructive. And its history ended with the government almost completely eradicating it, which included physical extermination of particularly hardcore adherents. Apparently, the death toll was quite significant. For all the incredible tolerance of the Romans for a wide variety of cults, the Roman state was more than capable of destroying dangerous religious organizations completely, even if these organizations were something like spin-offs of the traditional Roman religion. I draw your attention to this fact for a reason. As you know, there's also a myth about the incredible persecutions of Christianity by the Roman authorities. We will discuss this some other time, but in general, the situation looks like, well, if the Romans were serious about destroying Christianity, they would have destroyed it. They had the experience and they had all the tools necessary. Okay, basically that's it. That's all that can be said about orgies in Roman sources. But there is a lot to be said about traditional Roman morality. So I will very briefly give just a few interesting examples that will demonstrate the real state of affairs in this society. Let's go. We can talk about the Vestals, who were honored as living saints. Everyone knows about them, but they usually don't quite understand what these women actually were. I have a video on the subject on this channel. So instead, let's talk a little about the concept of pudicitia, which merged chastity and modesty in one. There was even a goddess of the same name. The concept applied to both men and women, but of course mostly to women. Titus Livy reports that back in the 3rd and 4th centuries BC, there were 2 temples in Rome, plebeian and patrician, dedicated to pudicitia, in which sacrifices could be performed only by respectable matrons. meaning those who had only one man in their lives, their husband. Divorced women were not allowed to participate in the sacrifices. In general, univira, a one-man woman, was considered a model of correct, decent, admirable behavior. Moving on, Cato the Elder, who held the position of censor, suspended Senator Manilius for embracing his wife before the eyes of his daughter. This was considered immoral behavior unworthy of a person of senatorial rank, something like a shameless public display of emotions. Yes, Cato was apparently just settling scores with a political opponent, but technically, he had the right to pull such a stunt. He had a good reason, a reason acceptable by the Senate. His great-grandson, known as Cato the Younger, was a Stoic. He had two women in his life. He was married to both of them. Obviously. Actually, he was married to his second wife twice, but that's a different story. Stoicism was quite popular, at least among the senatorial class, during a certain period and eventually gave Rome a Stoic emperor, Marcus Aurelius. Cato the Younger actually wasn't the most hardcore practitioner of Stoic views on marriage. The most extreme was probably Gaius Musonius Rufus, who believed that sex was only permissible for the purpose of procreation. However, he was probably the only person who honestly believed in this idea. His disciple Epictetus, for example, was much softer in his statements. He believed that sex could exist, and I quote, only within a framework of personal commitment. The official doctrine of the state under Augustus, and later, was traditionalism, with a focus on Roman virtue in the spirit of what Cato the Elder had advocated. For example, Augustus advanced the idea of banishment from Rome for adultery. And it wasn't just empty words, he eventually exiled his own daughter for that. In addition, Augustus also exiled Ovid, who had published a lewd, by Roman standards, book, The Art of Love. There are many examples like that. Ancient Rome was no Victorian England, a hypocritical repressive society. Well, it was a bit hypocritical too, yes, but let's face it, all sorts of things happened there and some of them were tolerated. But in the end, it was a fairly conservative society that tried to follow very strict traditional Roman morals. And the attempts to present it as a society of perverts and widespread sex parties are simply shameless propaganda and a deep misunderstanding of the culture of antiquity.